Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for the PARCC Accessibility Features and Accommodations for English Learners and Students with Disabilities, Part 2. The first webinar was given on October 29th, and this is a continuation of that webinar. My name is Annette Thacker-Bartlett, and I am with the OSSE Division of Elementary, Secondary, and Specialized Education, and today I will be co-presenting with Bonnie O'Keefe, who is with our Assessment and Data Division here at OSSE. Today we're going to start off with a brief overview of the new PARCC Accommodations Manual. This manual was newly released in November. It's the third edition, so we will be highlighting a few portions of that. We will also talk briefly about PARCC Accommodations for English Language Learners. We will discuss the Read Aloud accommodation. And we will discuss updates that will be happening in SEDS with PARCC accommodations, and then at the end we will talk about the personal needs profile. Throughout the webinar, we encourage you to type questions in the question chat box. We will do our best to answer those questions as we go along. If we do not get to your question, we will stay on the line after the webinar to continue to answer questions. And for those questions that we cannot answer today, we will take them down and go find out answers and follow up with you with an email. As I mentioned, today is part 2 of a webinar series on PARCC accommodations for English language learners and students with disabilities. We gave our first webinar on October 29th. If you were not able to join us at that time, we highly recommend that you go and view that webinar sometime at your convenience. It's not required that you view that webinar prior to this webinar. They aren't necessarily consecutive, but they both provide really valuable information. And here is a snapshot of where you can find the webinar on the Testing Accommodations website. In fact, I'm going to show you the website right now because we're going to talk about a lot of good information from this website. So what I'm going to do is take you on a field trip over to the OSSE website. So here I am on osse.dc.gov. And here on the website, it's a little tricky to navigate the website, so what I recommend is going up to the search box and typing in testing accommodations and doing a search there. And it will, the first thing that will pop up is the testing accommodations page for OSSE. When you come to this page, you will see here a link to the new manual, as well as other valuable information about testing accommodations. I'm scrolling down the page, and you'll see here again the link to the accommodations manual and a link to all of the appendices that go with this accommodation manual. And I'm scrolling down a little bit more. Here where it says additional PARCC resources, the first link is to the October webinar that I just mentioned, and the other links are to crosswalk documents that I discussed in depth in the October webinar, as well as a few other resource documents. So I encourage you to bookmark this page. There's lots of good stuff here. And so I'm actually going to go over to that new accommodations manual website. It takes me to the parcconline.org website. And here you can see that the third edition of the PARCC accommodations manual has been released in November. And you can print it, you can download it as a PDF. It's 67 pages long. It's got lots of good stuff, but some really important things would be in the appendices. Today in particular, I'm going to talk about Appendix D. That will come later in the webinar, but just to start off, I wanted to orient you to the website. So let's dive in and first talk about the manual itself and a few highlights. And again, I showed you where to find it, but I have a direct hyperlink here that you can use later. When it comes to your role in preparing for the PARCC, this is just a big picture overall of the process that you should be engaging in right now. At the very foundational level to all of this is for you to be very familiar with grade level standards, with those Common Core state standards and what is expected for students to achieve at each grade level. I'm preaching to the choir here. You already know all about the Common Core, and hopefully you're very immersed in that right now in your schools. And what you should be doing right now is the step 2, where you are learning about all of the accessibility features and accommodations that are available to certain student populations, and familiarizing yourself with that, as well as step 3, where you are actually selecting these features and accommodations for individual students. And this could be done by teams of people at your schools, by any testing coordination teams, or maybe you're working with individual teachers to select these accessibility features. And for accommodations for students with disabilities, the IEP teams are working on those. And then step 4, you actually are going to administer the test. And then step 5, afterwards, you're going to look back and reflect and evaluate how the process went, what can be improved, and things you can do to prepare for the next year. And this information came from page 49 of the manual. So just to highlight some of the appendices available to you, they talk about things like taking a paper-based assessment, which is a new concept this year because we are computerized. Also the read-aloud accommodations, extended time accommodations, requesting any kind of unique accommodation or emergency accommodation, and what to do if a student refuses an accommodation. And the appendices also have a variety of templates and checklists that you might find useful, so I encourage you to browse those and also to share those with your colleagues and administrators. And now I'm going to turn the time over to Bonnie, who's going to discuss briefly with you accommodations for English language learners.
Thanks, Annette, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. So we've had some questions about PARCC accommodations for English learners and accountability in terms of are English learners exempt from taking ELA portions of the test, and what are the policies around that? So we'd like to first review the policies around English language learners and which tests they need to take for the purposes of accountability. These policies haven't changed from previous years under the DC CAS, but this is a reminder that they still apply under PARCC. If an English language learner student arrived in the U.S. after the first day of last year's test, so sometime after March of 2014, they're not required to take the PARCC in ELA reading. If they don't take the PARCC, they must take the Access exam for ELLs later in the spring when it's offered, or they will count as a non-participant for your school. So ELL students new to the U.S. are still required to take PARCC in mathematics and the DC Science assessment, but of course they can do so using an array of accommodations for English learners. And to be clear, it's only the ELL students who do not have to take the PARCC in ELA reading are those who are new to the U.S. this year, as of March 2014. So all other ELL students should take the PARCC ELA reading with accommodations as appropriate. Next, we'll review how PARCC definitions of English learner status aligns to the WIDA access levels. So access is our assessment of ELL students in the district. And so this is going to be important for educators who may be assigning English learner accommodations to students on the PARCC. So WIDA has 6 levels, whereas the PARCC manual refers to beginning, intermediate, and advanced English language proficiency. So in the PARCC Accessibility Features and Accommodations Manual and in the DC CAS to PARCC crosswalks that Annette mentioned earlier, you'll see references to beginning, intermediate, and advanced English learners. So here you'll see on the left the WIDA access levels, which your students may have gotten from last year's access exam, and how they correspond to the PARCC definitions. You'll see here that levels 1 and 2 are beginning on PARCC. Levels 3 and 4 on access correspond to what the PARCC calls intermediate English language proficiency. Levels 5 and 6 on access correspond to what PARCC calls advanced English language proficiency. And for your reference, most PARCC accommodations for English learners are aimed and designed at students with beginning and intermediate English language proficiency. So we hope this chart will be helpful for you, and it's also available in the PARCC to DC CAS crosswalks on our OSSE website. So here is a snapshot of those crosswalks and what they look like. For example, at the top of this snapshot, you'll see the extended time accommodation. And so this is an accommodation that would likely benefit students with beginning, intermediate, or advanced English language proficiency. And it had the same name on the DC CAS. And you'll see a bit more guidance about the policy for its use on PARCC on the right-hand side. Another accommodation available to students on the PARCC is a bilingual dictionary. And we often get questions from schools asking for a list of appropriate dictionaries and glossaries for students to use. And so we wanted to refer you to this list, which was actually created by the Massachusetts Department of Education and is posted on the PARCC website. And that has a large list of appropriate bilingual dictionaries organized by language, which may be helpful to teams of educators as they're assigning this accommodation to students. When assigning accommodations to an English learner, there are three kinds of factors to consider. First, the student's English proficiency level according to Access or another assessment if the student has not taken Access. Second, the student's literacy in their native language. And third, any other factors that may impact their accommodations and their testing experience, such as, of course, their grade and their age, the time they've spent in English-speaking schools, and their comfort using English in an assessment context. And of course, if we're talking about English learners who are also students with disabilities, then they would additionally be eligible for any of the accommodations for students with disabilities. And teams should consider how these two things might intersect for a particular individual student. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Annette, and she's going to talk about the Read Aloud accommodations.
Thanks, Bonnie. And I do want to, before we move on from English language learners, I'm going to take you back to the website. And again, I'm on the OSSE website, and I have gone to the testing accommodations page. And if I scroll down to additional PARCC resources, the document that Bonnie showed you a picture of, where it's the crosswalk for the English language accommodations, the link to that is found right here. And we put the URL in the website slides as well. All right, let's talk about the Read Aloud. I use the word Read Aloud to describe what we're talking about, but officially these accommodations are not called Read Aloud, but I'm going to refer to them that way for the topic of what we're talking about. So we have here PARCC Read Aloud options. There's a variety of them. As you know, PARCC is now computerized, which means there's actually a wider variety of read aloud accommodations that can be used, even though, and there is, excuse me, so some of those that are available are the text-to-speech. The text-to-speech that can be turned on in the computer-based version of the test. And in this accommodation, students can actually highlight text on the screen, and it can play an audio recording, or they can pause an audio recording of that text. There's also a screen reader accommodation where the student, this can be used by students with visual impairments if they have not yet learned to use Braille or are unable to use Braille. There's also an ASL video accommodation on the computer-based test, and with this feature, a student can view an embedded video of the test content in American Sign Language along with the test content. And finally, there is a human reader or human signer option, which can be implemented with the paper-based tests. And these accommodations, they apply to item, response option, and passages on the PARCC. So there is a difference between the Read Aloud, between the guidelines for Read Aloud accommodations when it comes to math versus the ELA assessments. And so if you listen to my last webinar, we went pretty in depth on explaining the difference between accommodations versus accessibility features. And now just to give you a refresher on that, in prior years with the DC CAS, there was a whole list of accommodations available to students with disabilities. But this year, actually, some of those accommodations have actually, they're actually no longer accommodations, rather they're called accessibility features, which means that any student can have them if found appropriate. And so when it comes to the Read Aloud accommodations, for the ELA literacy exam, Read Aloud is still considered an accommodation, which means it's only available to students with disabilities when the IEP team has felt like that student meets the eligibility criteria for that accommodation. But when it comes to the math assessment, any Read Aloud accommodation is actually not an accommodation, it's an accessibility feature. So any student could qualify for that, but it just needs to be identified in advance on the student's personal needs profile, or PNP, which Bonnie will discuss at the end of the webinar. And again, they should not be assigned in a blanket way for any group of students. Assigning the Read Aloud accommodation needs to be individual for each student. And now, here is a change from the previous years with DC CAS. In the past, on DC CAS, if the Read Aloud accommodation was assigned to a student, then the score was invalidated. However, this year, under PARCC, with the PARCC guidelines for the Read Aloud on the ELA assessment, if the Read Aloud accommodation is assigned, the score will still remain valid, but only if the accommodation has been used in accordance with the guidelines. If a student is given a Read Aloud accommodation, but it's not in alignment with the guidelines, then the score may still be invalidated. Now, to help you decide whether or not a student qualifies for the Read Aloud or whether or not it's appropriate, there are a couple resources available in the manual and in Appendix D of the manual, and I'm going to go into detail about those on the next few slides. But we strongly encourage your IEP teams to follow this guidance and determine whether or not they should receive this Read Aloud. Because this year it's not going to invalidate the score, OSSE is definitely going to closely monitor the selection and use of the Read Aloud accommodation because we do not want it to be overprescribed to students outside of the guidelines. Here is a snapshot of page 34 of the accommodations manual. You'll see here on the left-hand column the 4 different types of Read Aloud accommodations that could be selected. And then on the right-hand column, you will see I've highlighted here some of the guidelines where it talks about the Read Aloud accommodation. And really, they should only be given to a very small number of students. And those should be students that are unable to participate in the assessment, would not be able to participate in the assessment without this accommodation because their disability severely limits or prevents their ability to access printed text by decoding. And again, now I am showing you a picture. So this first picture, this was the manual, and now this picture is actually a snapshot of the appendix, Appendix D to the manual. And what I really like about Appendix D is that it's a checklist. And it's a checklist just a couple of pages long, and it's a place where the IEP team could document their decision. And actually, I'm just going to go show you where to find this on the website. I want to show you the actual document. So I'm back here on the PARCC page where it has the manual, and I'm going down to Appendix D. When I open that up, you can see here what I have here is a 4-page document. And this, if you want to, you can actually use this document to fill it out for a student as documentation of why they are eligible for the Read Aloud. It's not required, but this could be a great way for you to show that the student meets the guidelines. Maybe you could use this during an IEP team meeting or something like that, or additional documentation that you upload to SEDS. Again, this isn't required, but I find this form actually pretty helpful if I were going to have to go decide about Read Aloud for a student. So here it has some guidelines for considering whether or not the student should get the Read Aloud. And first the student, of course, has to have an IEP or a 504 plan. And then the team needs to think about, okay, does the student have a visual impairment and cannot use Braille, or do they have a disability that severely limits or prevents them from accessing printed text? And so this goes into more detail about that. And then I'm going to scroll down to the next page. And it talks about how before you choose to give the read aloud to a student, you really need to think about what you've already done to provide them intensive instruction interventions and that hasn't gone very well, and now you feel like they need this accommodation. So here's a place to think about that. And actually, if you can scroll down, you can see here that it has a place for you to list the data that you used to determine that the student qualifies for the read aloud. And so I really like this form for that reason. So I encourage you to download this form and look it over with some of your colleagues and see if it could be useful to you in determining whether or not a student should get the read aloud accommodation. All right, now back to the slides. Here I just have pointed out some things from the document that I just showed you that are some considerations when choosing the read aloud. And again, here's a picture of the document. So I showed it to you live, so I'm just going to skip this slide here. And just one last slide on the read aloud. When you're using a read aloud on math, again, as a reminder, it's not an accommodation, it's an accessibility feature. You can still select it in the IEP, but just know that it's going to be an accessibility feature. But you do need to identify that in advance on the personal needs profile. And again, you're deciding this on an individual basis on an individual basis according to the guidelines. And of course, this might be discussed with an IEP team if a student does have a disability, but just know that they do not have to have a disability to get a read aloud accommodation for math. And speaking of which, PARCC Accommodations and SEDS. In my last webinar, I went into great depth about how SEDS right now does not have PARCC accommodations built into it. And so I talked a lot about what you're supposed to do in the meantime. And I'll just refresh you on that very briefly today, but I do encourage you to go back and watch that webinar. So just as an update, PARCC is going to be built into SEDS with the mid-year release, and the mid-year release actually might be happening at the end of December, so around December 20th, or it might not happen until early January. Either way, your school might be on holiday break during that time, so just anticipate that when you come back to school in January after the break, SEDS is going to be updated with its new changes. And there's really not that many changes that are going to be happening to SEDS, so you don't need to get worried or anything. The big change is that PARCC will be built into the system. And I'm going to walk you through what that's going to look like in just a minute. But I just want to remind you what you're supposed to do in the meantime if you happen to have an IEP team meeting before early January. Right now, the problem is that right now there's some PARCC accommodations that are unique to PARCC because it's on a computer, that you don't have a place to check those off in SEDS right now. So what you have to do is use a separate worksheet. And I'm just going to remind you about how to use the crosswalk documents that I talked about in the October webinar. Here I have an example of, let's say there's a student who qualifies for the PARCC accommodation of scribing or speech-to-text. If that's the case, then what you would do in SEDS is use this crosswalk to see what the equivalent accommodation is in SEDS, and you can see here that it's actually called oral response to test, so it has a different name than what it should be called under PARCC, but you would go ahead and check that box as a substitute for, and it will mean the same thing as the actual PARCC accommodation. So that's how you would use that crosswalk. And here is that additional worksheet that's in SEDS right now. In the case that if your student does need an accommodation that's not listed in SEDS right now, for example, closed captioning or descriptive video or a paper pencil edition, then you need to use this worksheet to document that right now. Or you can wait until early January to document that, because then it will be built into the SEDS system and you won't have to use this worksheet. And now if you already went and used this worksheet sometime in the last few months, don't worry, you're not going to have to do an amendment in January. If you already documented this accommodation on this worksheet and it's uploaded in SEDS, that's good enough for this year, you're going to be fine. You don't need to go amend everything in January. And now let's talk about what it's going to look like in SEDS in early January when those updates go live. What's going to happen is everywhere in SEDS that it says the word DC-CAS, we're going to take that out and replace it with the words statewide assessment. So that's not too big of a deal. We're just changing out the terminology to make sure that we are using current terminology, because DC-CAS is no longer the test we're using. And if it says DC-CAS alternate assessment, we're going to replace that with the words statewide alternate assessment. I just showed a few examples of where that change is going to happen, but there's over a dozen places where that change will happen. Another change that's going to happen is that a justification box is going to be added on the accommodations page. And this is because anytime you select an accommodation for a student, you need to provide a justification statement saying why the student is eligible for that accommodation. And it could be that your justification for that is the same one as for another accommodation, so you can just type the same thing in those boxes. Or it could be, if you do, this is again where the PARCC Accommodations manual will come in handy, because you can just quickly look up the eligibility criteria for that accommodation, and then you'll know exactly whether or not that student should get that accommodation. So this is a picture of what it's going to look like with the new justification text field next to the accommodation checklist. Another thing that's going to change is those little boxes at the bottom of the accommodations page. When you have an asterisk, when you have an asterisk next to a certain accommodation, then you go look at the bottom and it has this message that tells you that the student score is going to be invalidated, for example, if you check the read aloud, or maybe it'll say it's not applicable for the DC-CAS. Well, that language is going to change because DC-CAS is no longer relevant. So the asterisk boxes that you're going to see at the bottom of the page are going to say, the first one, it's going to say this accommodation is intended for a small number of students. So you'll see this asterisk quite a bit, because there are a lot of the accommodations that are really very specific for only a small number of students. An example of that is the read aloud accommodation. The second box is explaining how it used to be an accommodation, but now it's actually considered an accessibility feature. And we did talk about that, but we didn't want to erase those from SEDS, even though technically you're not required to document them in SEDS because they're an accessibility feature and no longer considered an accommodation. We didn't want to take those away from SEDS because that might be really confusing. So it's still listed there as in the list of accommodations, but if you see that double asterisk, that means that it's actually an accessibility feature. But it could be easy for you to just document it there, so we left that in. And the third box here, the triple asterisk, is talking about how it's a classroom accommodation, but not necessarily for the assessments. And then it's referring you to the manual also for things like the extended time accommodation and unique accommodation. So there's some special things there with certain accommodations that you want to go look up in the manual. So that's just a heads up about that. Now let's go look at what's going to change. So right now, here I have a snapshot of what it looks like in SEDS right now when you do select the read aloud, the assisted reading or the reading of the entire comprehension test. As you know, when you check those boxes in SEDS right now, the message at the bottom pops up and says, hey, your score is going to be invalidated if you check this box. Well, that is language talking about the DC-CAS. And as you know, as we just discussed, for PARCC, the score will not be invalidated. So this language obviously is now outdated. So when we update SEDS, the new language is going to say that this accommodation is intended for a small number of students. Please go read about it in the manual. So to take away that language, so that doesn't scare you about it being invalidated, etc. As you know, there's 4 categories of accommodations, so I'm going to go through each of those 4 categories and tell you what's going to be different. So first I'm going to talk about the response category. I have on the left a picture of what it looks like in SEDS right now when you go to the accommodations in the response area. And on the right-hand side, you will see that there's actually going to be a completely new list of accommodations for the response category. So they're taking away the old list and putting it in with this new list. Now, some of these are very similar, but because PARCC is so much different than DCCAS in some ways, we're just swapping out the entire list here. So, but again, the swap, you don't need to be concerned, because if you selected something in SEDS earlier for DCCAS, you don't have to go and amend the IEP just because this list got updated. What you selected in DCCAS is going to be fine, because there's that crosswalk document that shows how the DCCAS accommodation can substitute in when you click the box in SEDS for what you would have clicked for PARCC. So you don't need to go amend everything just because this list is getting swapped out. It should remain the same in SEDS even after the update as far as in the type of accommodation you selected. Now let's look at the timing and scheduling category. Here, if you see a red arrow, that means the language is going to change just a little bit. So most of this list is going to look pretty much the same. There's just a few little tweaks in the language to make sure that this is aligned more with PARCC. And here you can see there is an example of the triple asterisk, where if you go down and look at that blue box at the bottom, I already showed you that blue box a few minutes ago, but this is just an example of how there's an accommodation that has those triple asterisk mark. Here is the setting category. So this is the third category of accommodations. This one really isn't going to change very much at all. The only change here, as you can see next to the red arrow, that they're adding the word headphones to the noise buffer. And the note at the bottom that you will see in SEDS is going to say, hey, just a reminder, this is actually not an accommodation, it's an accessibility feature. So any student could qualify for it if they meet the criteria, but we're still going to let you document it in SEDS if you want to, because it's probably easier. And if you want to read more about the headphones, because there's a lot of special rules about if a student uses headphones or if they use the read aloud, things like that, just to make sure it doesn't distract the other students. There's some guidance around that. And the last category, the presentation category, this one's actually going to change the most, because with the computerized test, there's just so many things that are different about presentation. So here on the left, you'll see a picture of what the list looks like right now in SEDS. The ones that are going to stay the same, I've denoted with the green same. But the ones that are different, if you look at the Braille one, that's actually going to be split up into multiple types of Braille accommodations. And I'm going to show you those on the next slide. And the markers to maintain place, you notice the language has changed a little bit to include the words mask answer. And if you notice that double asterisk mark, if you remember from the previous slide, the double asterisk means it's an accessibility feature. It's not really an accommodation anymore. But we still left it in the list. And in the red, of course, you see the read aloud accommodations listed there. We already talked about how those are going to change. And let me show you the list, the new list of what this section is going to look like. So here's the new list of what you will see, of what your options are. Now I'm going to give you a minute just to look over this list. If you notice, it's delineating between what's for the ELA literacy assessment versus what's an accommodation for the math assessment. And we already discussed this when we were talking about the read aloud accommodation. The criteria for when you're eligible for the read aloud might be different for the math test versus the ELA test. And again, so we really spelled that out here so you can choose exactly what the accommodation is that you're talking about. And you can see here we've listed the 4 different types of read aloud you can have with the screen reader, the human reader, text-to-speech, and the ASL video. So that concludes our section about the accommodations in SEDS. And the last section of the webinar is going to be on the personal needs profile, so I'm going to turn it over to Bonnie.
Great. So if you've heard the term personal needs profile before, you might be a little confused as to what that means. So the personal needs profile is a collection of information on students who will receive any sort of special test conditions, materials, accessibility features, or accommodations on PARCC. And essentially, it's a student-level data file that collects all that information in one place. The PNP serves a couple different purposes. First, it tells the PARCC test software which version of the computer-based test each student needs to receive. So if Bonnie logs into the test online, I'll have the text-to-speech feature enabled if I need it. But when Annette logs into the test at the same time in the same room, she'll get the color contrast version of the test because that's the version that she needs. So it's each student's personal needs for that test. So the second thing the PMP is for is that it allows schools, LEAs, and OSSE to track assignment of accommodations and accessibility features all in one place. So now with PARCC that we have accommodations for students with disabilities, accommodations for English language learners, and also accessibility features that are available to everyone. So now we're throwing a whole new population of students into the mix here. We think the PMP will be a very useful tool for all of us to keep track of all those things in one place. And third, the PMP tells test administrators what each student in their test session needs. So if Ms. Stewart is administering a test to 3 students, she can look at the PMP for her students and know that, for example, one might need frequent breaks, one might need ASL video activated for their test, one might need a bilingual dictionary, so she can make sure before the test that she has the bilingual dictionary to give to that student. So even if an accommodation is documented in SEDS, they will also need to be noted on the PNP for a student to receive that accommodation on PARCC. So very similar to for the CAS, how you might have told us we need a Braille booklet for this student so that we would know to send you those special materials ahead of the test. With this computer-based test and with so many different versions and features of the test, the PMP is how you tell PARCC what that student needs. So the PMP, when you look at it, is basically a checklist of all the administrative considerations, accessibility features identified in advance, and accommodations a student might need. So examples of things that are captured in the PMP include frequent breaks, test format, things like color contrast, that's an example of an accessibility feature, ASL video, which is an accommodation, closed captioning on video and audio, that's also an accommodation. So the PMP applies to both paper and computer tests because even if you're not using it to tell the computer what sort of test it needs to give you, it can still serve those other purposes for paper tests of collecting all that information in one place and tracking it. So the next step is how do you create a PMP? This is definitely something we'll be following up on with further training in a webinar down the line. But I'm going to give you all a preview right now so you get an idea of what it's going to look like. So PMPs can be managed at either the school level or the LEA level, and that's really a choice of what works for you and your LEA. And there are 2 ways to create and edit a PMP. One is as an Excel file, so a data file that can have multiple students in it, as many students as you need, which is then uploaded to Pearson Access Next. Pearson Access Next is the back-end system for administering the PARCC test. So all of you will have access to Pearson Access Next if you're a test administrator, if you're a special education coordinator, if you're a school coordinator. So this is the back-end system of managing the PARCC. And then there's also a way in which, for one student at a time in the Pearson Access Next user interface, you can sort of click on and off different accessibility features and accommodations in the park. So the two ways are as an Excel file that you download and upload, or one student at a time in Pearson Access Next. Additionally, there will be an optional guidance document that educator teams may use to walk through all the accommodations and accessibility features captured in the PNP. OSSE doesn't plan to collect this document, but it may be useful for your school or LEA. If, for instance, you have one data person who's going to be collecting all the PNP information and uploading it, you might use this Word document to help teams walk through everything that's on the PNP and what students need, and then have a single person collect it and upload it. So that will be posted on the PARCC and OSSE website soon, but wanted to give you a preview of what's coming. So first, I'm going to show you very briefly what it looks like in Pearson Access Next when you use the user interface to see one student's PNP. And as I mentioned before, we are going to cover this more thoroughly in a future training, but just so you have an example of what I'm talking about here, because I know it's sort of hard to grasp what we mean when we're just talking about it on a PowerPoint. So I'm going to bring up here this website, parcc.pearson.com, which is basically going to be your home base for anything you need to administer the park. You'll see along the top, Pearson Access Next, tech setup, manuals and training, test preparation, that's where you'll access the practice tests. But what we're focusing on today is Pearson Access Next, which, as I mentioned, is that back-end system. I'm going to go to the training website because I'm going to show you a sample student that I created to show you her PNP. But when you are actually doing the test, you would log in to the Washington, D.C. version of the site right here. But instead, I'm going to go to training and sign in with my username. And here's what the site looks like. So right now my organization is District of Columbia because I'm a state level user, but I'm going to change it to the sample school I created called DC Sample School. You'll see at the top that I'm set to the spring PBA exam for PARCC of 2015. And so I want to look at one of my students' registration and assign her some accessibility features and accommodations that she needs. So I'm going to go to Students here, Show All Results to list all my students. I'll pick this student here at the top. And what I want to do is manage her tests. So I'll choose Manage Student Tests in this drop-down task menu. And so here we have for this student, Grade 7 ELA Literacy Test. She's a student at DC Sample School. You'll see here she's in Ms. O'Keefe's 7th grade class for her assessment location. She's taking the test online. And as I scroll down, you'll see checkboxes here of all the different types of accessibility features and accommodations that are captured in the PNP. So this doesn't capture absolutely everything, but it's a lot of stuff. So, for example, maybe for this student, she needs frequent breaks. So I will check mark that here. And perhaps a color contrast of white font on a black background. And maybe she also needs closed captioning on any videos that she's watching. So I'll check mark that here. This is a very interesting array of accommodations for a student, but I'm sort of just checking them at random at this point. Down here, response accommodations, answers recorded in test book, maybe an external word prediction device. And these little eyes next to each option gives you a brief explanation of what it means. So this is another way to refer back to what each of these terms means, since many of the terms are different from what you might be used to seeing on the DC CAS or on SEDS. And you can see they are broadly categorized by timing and scheduling accommodations, accommodations for English learners, response accommodations, accessibility features, and considerations for administration. So this is the user interface example. If I wanted to manage my whole school at one time and assign all the students that needed an accessibility feature accommodation, I might use this Excel file. So this is a sample file format that can be downloaded from Pearson Access Next. If I go back to my home page, I would just go to the support page, and there are templates for the PMP and for different files on PARCC that I could download from there. So that's exactly where I got it. And you can see this is basically each row here would be a student, and it's a long checklist that goes across that covers everything we just saw on the website. So first some key information about that student: test format, frequent breaks, separate or alternate location, small testing group. And so you'd basically just use this file to check off what a large group of students might need, or what each student, as many as you want, might need. And then once you were done formatting that and entering in anything a student needs, you would then upload it to the Pearson Access Next system, and that student's test registration would automatically be updated, so that when that student logged into his or her test, they would get what they needed. And I know that was a quick overview, but do know that we know this is important, and we know this is new for a lot of folks. So we are going to be offering more training on it in the future once everyone has access to the Pearson system and we've gotten students registered for tests. So be on the lookout for that in the LEA Look Forward. And finally, I'll turn it over to Annette to wrap things up.
Thanks, Bonnie. I did see one question coming in for you, Bonnie, from participants. They were wondering how soon they will be able to get access to the tool that you just showed them.
Sure. So right now, I'm working with folks, assessment leads from each of the LEAs, to get students registered for PARCC. And the registration deadline is next Friday. So that is a pressing need right now. But once students are registered, that's when you can start going in and filling out PMPs. So I would say at the earliest, it would be by mid-December that you would have access to all this. And it would really depend on your LEA's plan for assigning the PMP. As I mentioned, it could be managed at the school or the local level. So I would say starting probably in the beginning of the new year, maybe mid-December, definitely be talking with your colleagues and figuring out what your LEA's plan is going to be for managing the PMP. But folks will start to be able to have access from the state level as of mid-December.
Thanks, Bonnie. Yeah, it sounds like right now is a good time for you to have conversations with your administrators and colleagues about how that's going to be divvied up. With the every LEA is a different shape and a different size, so that's definitely individual to the LEA. We leave it in your hands to decide if the PMPs will be managed at a central office level or at a school level and things like that. And definitely more guidance will be coming. Now, to conclude, just the last 2 minutes, I want to tell you about upcoming trainings to help you get ready for PARCC. So on Friday, hopefully you've heard about this, on Friday there's a PARCC 101 training that's happening here at OSSE. It's happening very late in the day so that you don't have to miss any school time. This is not specifically about accommodations or special populations. This is just straight up PARCC 101, overview of PARCC, the different types of items you'll see on it, and instructional implications, test resources, etc. So you can actually still register for that and come this Friday if you're interested. This information is posted in the LEA Look Forward and on the OSSE homepage calendar as well. And next week we have a training called PARCC Readiness for Administrators. Bonnie is going to be giving that training. It's going to be great. And if you're not able to make it into that training, we're actually going to have a webinar version of this training coming up so that everybody can have access to this information, because it's really important that school leaders and administrators are informed about PARCC, not just the teachers or the test coordinators. And any other PARCC trainings, there's actually going to be a lot of PARCC trainings coming up, but the dates haven't been finalized yet. So just read the look forward every week and see what pops up. And I do want to announce a very special PARCC Institute that's coming up on Friday, January 23rd. I don't know if any of you were able to make it to the last LEA Institute that happened in November at the Washington Convention Center. That institute was focused on connecting schools to different government agencies, social services and behavioral health and things like that. But now this institute, we've asked ourselves here at OSSE, what do schools need from us right now? And the response we got was that schools want information and support around PARCC and all the other next generation assessments. So this is going to be an entire day packed full of information about PARCC and the other statewide assessments that are coming up. We're going to have a keynote speaker, we're going to have a panel, and then we're going to have a lot of different breakout sessions on things like communication strategies and how you can get the word out about PARCC to your parents and communities. We're also going to talk about curriculum alignment and instructional shifts. We're going to talk about technology readiness and the procedures for assessment, as well as considerations for special populations. So there's going to be a lot of different workshops, a lot of great resources, free lunch, and it's going to be held at the Kellogg Center at Gallaudet University. So the registration link actually isn't up yet. It should be up probably by the end of the week. So watch for that online and in the look forward. And for now, just save the date. Tell your teachers and your administrators to save the date. It's going to be a great institute, and there will be opportunities to earn professional learning units as well if you participate in this. And that concludes today's webinar. If you have any follow-up questions that you were not able to ask today, please send them to osse.assessments@dc.gov. So this is anything from PARCC administration, accommodations, any trainings coming up, any questions about Common Core, professional development, any information about the educator leader cadre, send it to this email and we'll make sure the question gets into the hands of the right person. If you have questions specifically about SEDS and PARCC, you need to reach out to your LEA's special education point of contact. Each LEA has this point of contact. Some of you are listening on today's webinar. That's great. And this person is your main go-to person for anything to do with SEDS. And if they cannot answer your question, they can reach out to OSSE using the OSSE support tool to get the answer to your question about anything to do with SEDS. And again, we thank you for joining us today. A recording of this webinar is going to be posted hopefully by the end of the week. I'm going to email each of you a copy of the slides from today, and we're going to look at your questions that we weren't able to answer and send you a follow-up email. But for right now, I'm going to end the webinar, but we're going to stay on the line to continue to answer your questions by typing in the box if you have them. So thank you for attending today, and we'll see you next time.